3 days before the biggest night of my career, my father called to tell me he wasn't coming. His reason was 4 words long: "Your brother needs me." I was standing in my apartment in downtown Toronto, still in my work clothes, holding a glass of water I'd poured before my phone lit up with his name. I set the glass down on the counter very carefully, like I was afraid of what I might do if my hands didn't have something gentle to hold. I asked him what he meant. He explained, slowly, like he was speaking to someone who might not understand, that my brother Graham had just landed a major contract with a developer in Mississauga and was running into serious cash flow issues. The deal needed a family meeting. "Strategy," he said. "Family strategy." The award gala where I was receiving the Rising Leader recognition at the Canadian Construction Finance Summit, an event I'd spent 4 years building toward, an event my firm's senior partners had cleared their schedules to attend, was scheduled for that Friday evening at the Fairmont Royal York in downtown Toronto. My father had agreed 8 weeks ago to sit at the family table. He'd even asked me what time the dinner portion started. Now he was talking about my brother's cash flow. Before I could say anything, my mother came on the line. She must have been sitting right next to him. "Stella, be reasonable," she said. Her voice had the specific tone she reserved for conversations where she'd already decided the outcome. "Your brother's business affects this whole family. You know how much pressure he's under right now. The gala is a lovely thing. We're very proud, but you'll have colleagues there, you'll be fine. Graham needs your father at the table this weekend." I stood very still by the counter. I told them both I understood completely. I told them I hoped Graham's meeting went well. Then I said goodnight and ended the call before either of them could hear anything in my voice that I wasn't ready to give them. My fiancé James was in the living room, half watching the news with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He took one look at my face and put the laptop down. He didn't ask what happened right away. He just came to the kitchen, poured a second glass of water, and set it in front of me. James had known my family for 3 years. He'd seen the pattern, the way any achievement of mine somehow triggered a crisis on my brother's side that required everyone's immediate attention. My call to the bar, my first major acquisition file, the day I made senior associate. Each time, a competing emergency from Graham's direction that our parents found more pressing. James asked me what I wanted to do. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd saved under the firm name only, Mercer Capital Advisory. The man who answered had been expecting my call for longer than either of us had ever said aloud. His name was Victor. I should explain who Victor is, because without that explanation, nothing that followed would make any sense. My father built his construction supply business, a mid-sized materials distributor operating out of Hamilton, Ontario, on the foundation of a partnership he entered at 32 years old. His partner was Victor, who at the time was one of the sharpest procurement strategists in commercial construction across the Golden Horseshoe. Victor had the supplier relationships, the operational knowledge, the business plan, and the industry contacts. My father had a customer list and access to a leased warehouse near the industrial park off Barton Street. They shook hands, they signed partnership agreements. For 5 years, they built something real together. And then, when the company was finally turning a consistent profit and had secured supply contracts with 3 major general contractors in the GTA, my father decided he didn't want a partner anymore. What followed was methodical. My father began moving company funds through accounts Victor had never been given signing authority on. He restructured the partnership agreement with a solicitor Victor had never met. When Victor finally realized what was happening and filed a formal complaint, my father had already arranged for a forensic accountant, one whose invoice was paid directly by my father's personal holding company, to produce a report suggesting Victor had been diverting funds for years. The report was manufactured. Victor spent 14 months fighting a civil lawsuit, lost his share of the business in the settlement, and walked away from the industry he'd given his career to. My father went on to run the company for 2 more decades. My mother put his name on a plaque at the local Chamber of Commerce dinner. My brother Graham was handed the keys to it when he turned 30. I met Victor 8 years ago at an industry conference in Ottawa where I was speaking on construction contract law. I had no idea who he was. He introduced himself simply as the founder of Mercer Capital, a boutique firm that had developed a specialty in acquiring distressed debt in the construction sector. We stayed in touch. A year later, working through some documents on a file, he figured out whose daughter I was. He did not pull back, he leaned in. Victor told me everything over a 3-hour dinner on Elgin Street, in the kind of quiet restaurant where the tables are far enough apart that no one overhears. He was not bitter the way I expected. He was precise. He had spent the years since the settlement rebuilding, and he had rebuilt exceptionally well. Well enough that Mercer Capital's portfolio now included a significant portion of the debt my brother's company had accumulated through reckless expansion, and the personal guarantees my father had signed against the original company's assets to cover Graham's shortfalls. Over the 4 years that followed that dinner, Victor and I worked quietly. My firm handled the legal architecture. His firm provided the capital. Every time my brother's growing operation needed refinancing, and it needed refinancing constantly because Graham had a genuine talent for deals that looked impressive and performed terribly, private creditors stepped in through layered holding companies registered in Ontario. We bought the receivables. We bought the equipment financing. We bought the mortgage my father had taken against the Hamilton warehouse that was supposed to be the business's most stable asset. We bought the bridge loan my brother had signed to fund the Mississauga developer deal. The exact deal my father called me about on Tuesday, the same crisis that was apparently worth more than my Friday evening. The loan was already in default. The deal had collapsed 3 days before my father picked up the phone to tell me his family strategy session mattered more than my gala. My brother hadn't told him yet because my brother hadn't figured out how. When my father said goodnight on Tuesday and hung up, I called Victor and said, "It's time." He said he would drive up from Waterloo in the morning. The Fairmont Royal York is the kind of building that makes you stand up straighter walking through the lobby. Dark wood paneling, brass fittings, ceilings high enough to make the chandeliers look small. The Canadian Construction Finance Summit drew around 250 people that year. Project managers, developers, lenders, lawyers, and a handful of government liaisons from Queen's Park and the Federal Infrastructure Desk. It was not the sort of event where you expected a family to fall apart publicly. It was the sort of event where people discussed interest rate risk over very good Ontario Pinot Noir. James and I arrived through a side entrance 40 minutes before dinner. My event coordinator met us near the ballroom and told me, with the careful tone of someone delivering information they'd rather not, that my family had checked in 20 minutes earlier. I was not surprised. There was a printed program with my name in it. There was going to be a mention in the Financial Post on Monday. My brother had a particular sensitivity to coverage he wasn't the center of. I told my coordinator the family table reservation didn't need to be held for the awards segment. She looked uncertain. I told her the gentleman escorting me to the podium would be a Mr. Victor Mercer and that she should have his badge waiting at the door. Then I went to find Victor. He was in a small meeting room near the back of the hotel's conference wing, wearing a dark charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who've worn them for decades. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, quiet in the manner of someone who'd learned that silence is a more effective instrument than volume. He stood when I came in and asked simply how I was doing. I told him I was fine, and I meant it. What I felt standing in that room was not rage. It was something much colder and more settled. The clarity that comes when you've stopped needing anything from the people who refuse to give it. I had been done for a long time, but tonight they would understand exactly what done looked like. We went over the sequence one more time. James had confirmed that afternoon that the Ontario Superior Court had approved the enforcement proceedings on the personal guarantees. The company's operating line was frozen. The Mississauga deal was dead. Victor and I walked to the ballroom together. The room was warm with candlelight and the low sound of a jazz trio near the far wall. James put his hand briefly at my back. I let myself breathe. Across the room, near one of the round tables set back from the stage, I could see them. My brother was working the crowd, moving from group to group with his hand extended. His wife Chloe was beside him in a burgundy blazer, nodding along to something a developer was saying while scanning for a better conversation. My mother sat at the table adjusting the centerpiece, which didn't need adjusting. My father was looking at the stage with the expression of a man doing real estate calculations in his head. He had not come to see me receive an award. He had come because Graham wanted access to the room. I no longer felt hurt by that, I felt confirmed. The dinner service moved through its early segments: sponsor remarks, a short video on sustainable infrastructure, the predictable discussion between a developer and a lender about rate environment. I sat with Victor and James at a table near the front, 4 rows from my family's table. I knew the moment my father noticed Victor. I didn't look directly at him, I didn't need to. I caught it peripherally. The way he leaned forward, squinted across the room, and then sat back very carefully, like a man trying not to be seen reacting. I saw my mother notice him noticing and follow his gaze. I saw her mouth move. My father gave a small, tight shake of his head. Victor was talking to the deputy minister beside him about transit corridor development. He did not look back. My brother, still circulating with business cards in hand, hadn't caught up yet. When the MC called my name and announced the award, the room applauded with the warmth that 250 people produce for someone who has genuinely earned something. I stood. Victor stood with me. He offered his arm, I took it, and we walked to the stage. That was when my father rose halfway from his chair. He caught himself and sat back down. The movement drew my mother's attention. Across the room, my brother had stopped talking mid-sentence and turned toward the stage with an expression I had never seen on his face. The particular expression of a man who recognizes a specific threat and cannot immediately calculate the correct response. 250 people watched Victor walk me to the podium. They saw a silver-haired man with the bearing of someone who had built real things, escorting a woman to receive an industry award. They saw my father in the third row, gripping the edge of the table, the color leaving his face in a way that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Victor stepped to the presenter's microphone beside the podium. The MC, who had been briefed, stepped back. Victor spoke for 4 minutes. He talked about what it actually takes to build something lasting in this industry. Not the deals that look good at signing, but the ones that hold up over 10 years of rate cycles and labor shortages and city planning delays. He talked about the difference between people who take credit and people who do the work. He talked about watching a young construction finance lawyer ask harder questions than anyone else in a room at a conference in Ottawa 8 years ago, and knowing immediately that she was someone who understood what the industry needed. He did not say my father's name, he did not need to. Every person in that room who had done business in Southern Ontario construction for more than 20 years knew Victor Mercer. They knew Mercer Capital. They knew his reputation, and the ones who'd been in Hamilton in the early 2000s remembered the other thing too. I accepted the award, I thanked my firm, I thanked James, I thanked Victor by name clearly, and said that he had shown me what integrity looks like in an industry that doesn't always make it easy to practice. The applause was genuine and sustained. Then I said I had a brief additional matter to share with the room. The MC stayed out of my way. I nodded to James at the back. The screen behind the stage, which had been showing the conference logo, changed. What appeared was not a presentation, it was a single court-stamped document. An enforcement notice from the Ontario Superior Court of Justice addressed to the holding company that controlled my father's construction supply business. The text was clear and legible from 20 feet. The company was in default on its primary operating credit facility. Personal guarantees had been called. Court-appointed receivership proceedings had been approved effective that week. The room went still in the way of 250 people doing rapid calculation. I explained calmly that the company named in that document was the business my father had spent 25 years calling his Suzuki. I explained that for the past 4 years, his ability to continue operating it had depended on refinancing arranged by private creditors he'd never identified. I explained that every time my brother signed a loan he couldn't service, every time my father guaranteed Graham's expansion debts against company assets, those notes had been purchased by entities my firm controlled. I told them the Mississauga deal, the crisis that had required my father's presence at a family strategy session rather than at his daughter's recognition gala 3 days ago, had already been dead for a week. The bridge financing behind it was one of our vehicles. It had collapsed the previous Tuesday. My brother had not yet told my father. The screen changed twice more. The second document was a CRA audit referral filed 6 weeks prior, detailing discrepancies in how shareholder loans had been structured over the past decade. The third was a summary from 15 years earlier, the partnership dissolution, the settlement Victor had been forced to accept, the forensic accounting report that had been produced against him, and, beside the name of the firm that produced it, a sworn statement from a former employee, filed in an unrelated civil matter years later, confirming that the report's conclusions had been directed, not independent. My father was on his feet. He had stood at some point during the second document and was gripping the back of his chair like it was the only fixed object in the room. My mother had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of her. My brother's wife Chloe was completely still, staring at the screen. She had signed a personal spousal guarantee 4 months earlier on one of Graham's equipment financing agreements. I watched her understand what that meant. My father found his voice and said my name across the room, sharp, commanding, the voice he used when he expected to be obeyed. He moved toward the stage. He stopped at the edge, below the platform, and looked up at me. He said I had no right to do this here. He said if I had concerns about how the business was managed, I should have come to him privately. He said I was embarrassing the family in front of the entire industry. I looked at him. I said I had tried to come to him privately. I'd told him at 32 that Graham's expansion model was unsustainable. I'd told my mother at Christmas 2 years ago that the debt structure was going to create a problem. Both of them had looked at me across the holiday table and explained that I didn't understand construction because I worked in law. I said that 3 days ago he'd told me a family strategy session was more important than the evening I was currently standing in, and that the deal at the center of that session had already been dead for a week without anyone having told him. My brother tried to say something from his table. His voice broke on the first word and he stopped. I looked at my father steadily. I told him the enforcement proceedings were happening regardless of tonight, regardless of this room, regardless of whether he had come to the gala or not. The receivership trustees had been appointed Wednesday. The accounts had been frozen Thursday morning. Tonight was Friday. He would have found out this weekend regardless. The only thing tonight changed was who else knew. Victor stepped beside me at the microphone. He looked at Father with an expression I will remember clearly for the rest of my life. Not anger, not triumph, just the settled calm of something finally resolved. He said 2 sentences. He said he had waited a long time to stand in a room like this again. And he said he was glad he'd waited because the room was considerably better for it. My father did not respond. He stood at the edge of the stage for a moment that went on too long, and then he turned and walked toward the exit, my mother following without looking back at me. My brother stayed seated. His wife picked up her bag, stood without speaking to him, and walked toward the opposite exit. They did not exchange a word. Graham sat alone at the table for the rest of the evening, his phone face down in front of him, while the room returned to its conversations around him. My father's lawyer was reached by phone at 9 that night. The family strategy meeting scheduled for the weekend became instead a call with a court-appointed receiver and a partner from a Toronto insolvency firm. The brass plaque legacy, the Hamilton warehouse, the trucks and the contracts and the framed photo of the company's first fleet hanging in the front office, all of it would go through the receiver's administration in the months that followed, with the proceeds directed first to the creditors, which meant directed to us. Victor and I walked out of the Royal York just after 10. The November air off Bay Street was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that feels like it's doing you a favor. James came out behind us and handed me my coat. We had made no plan for a celebration that felt right. What had happened that evening was not a celebration in the conventional sense. It was a correction, slow, patient, precisely executed, and corrections don't require balloons. James's colleague had put together a quiet dinner at a place on King Street West that we'd eaten at 100 times before. 14 people at a long table in a back room. A few colleagues from my firm, Victor, 2 friends from law school, James's sister who had driven down from Oakville. Someone had called ahead about the menu. There was wine from Prince Edward County that someone's client had sent over months ago, and that had been sitting in a cupboard waiting for the right occasion. It was loud and warm and completely ordinary in the best way. Nobody made a speech, nobody needed to. At some point near the end of the night, after the plates had been cleared and people were settled into the kind of comfortable conversation that happens when no one is in a hurry, Victor leaned over and said something quietly enough that only James and I could hear. He said that for a long time after he lost the company, he'd carried the story of it like a wound he couldn't explain to people without sounding like he was asking for something. He said the hardest part wasn't the money, it was learning to stop measuring himself by what had been taken. He said he hoped that whatever I was carrying from my family, I'd find a way to set it down before it took as long as it had taken him. I thought about that for a while. I thought about my father on the phone on Tuesday, his voice matter of fact, no apology in it, "Your brother needs me," like it was the most natural sentence in the world. I thought about all the versions of that sentence across all the years, every small diversion that had added up into something that had shaped me more than I used to want to admit. I had spent a long time trying to deserve their attention. Then I had spent time trying to accept I wouldn't get it. And somewhere between those two things, without quite meaning to, I had built a life that didn't need their approval to stand up straight. That wasn't a lesson my family taught me. It was a lesson they made necessary. Outside, Toronto was doing the thing it does in late November, fine snow drifting down under the streetlights, quiet in the way the city goes quiet after midnight when the late restaurants start closing. James and I walked to the car without hurrying. The cold felt clean against my face. I thought about what Victor had said about the family we choose, and I thought about the 14 people at that table who had not required a printed program or a brass plaque or a last-minute strategy meeting to show up for me, who had simply shown up for years, because that is what chosen people do. The city was still and cold and very beautiful, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be.